Hello, my name is Scott Hubbard. I was the NASA Ames Center Director and the only NASA representative on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. That started with the tragedy February 1st, 2003, and my service continued for just about 7 months. My experience with the Columbia tragedy started on February 1st, 2003 at about 6:30 in the morning West Coast time. My wife and I were awake, but we weren't up yet. She turned on the radio. She said, "Listen to this." The announcer came on and said, "The shuttle Columbia is overdue." Now, I knew immediately that something had happened because there's no such thing as an overdue shuttle. Once you commit to re-entry, that vehicle is a very heavy glider. So I got up, I pulled on some clothes. For reasons I still don't understand, I grabbed my cell phone and I went upstairs to where the television is, and I switched it on, and I saw what people all over the nation, all over the world were seeing, which were streaks in the skies of Texas. Some Dallas-Fort Worth TV station was showing an image of what they thought would be the shuttle going overhead. Later on, of course, we learned that what they were seeing was the debris and the breakup of the shuttle. So just about then, my cell phone went off. I answered it. It was Fred Gregory, the deputy administrator, and Fred said, something tragic has happened. We're not sure exactly what, but we're activating the contingency plan we have for a major mishap. And there's one spot on this accident board that is for a senior NASA person, either an associate administrator or a center director, not connected with the shuttle program. The administrator, Sean O'Keefe, would like you to fill that slot. Would you be willing to do that? And I said, well, of course, sir, I would be honored to serve in that capacity. Fred went on to say that the contingency plan called for a 30-day effort, so he expected that would be the extent of my participation. Of course, we later on found out that it went on for 7 months. He said, well, there's going to be a telecon this afternoon. We're in the process of getting our chairman lined up. Where will you be? And I said, well, I'll go down to the center and participate from there. So I went down, and that afternoon, as many people as they could find were on the telecon. We were introduced to our chairman, retired four-star Admiral Hal Gaiman, who, by the way, had also served on the coal investigation. And they said, we're organizing first at Barksdale Air Force Base. The initial plan is for search and recovery of whatever we can find. Can you be there? And I said, yes, of course. And so the very next day, I got on a airplane, a chartered airplane, and flew to Barksdale Air Force Base and began what was a 7-month odyssey through the Columbia tragedy and all the things associated with it. The selection of the chair was something that was not put into process in the mishap investigation contingency plan. I was told that when they decided to activate the plan, there was a very specific list that I saw later of people from the FAA and various military flight organizations, but the chair was not designated. Sean O'Keefe, who had a long history of working with the Navy, and in fact had been briefly the Secretary of the Navy, reached into his back pocket, I guess, and pulled out the name of Admiral Gaiman, who was known well for doing an extraordinary job of the coal investigation, not the specific people who carried out that act of terrorism, but rather the why of it. Why was it that the security broke down to such an extent? And it was very clear from my first meeting with Hal that he could lead people. He was a very friendly guy. He was very clear, very to the point, and he had a characteristic of being able to pull together people from all different groups, not just military, but people with a science and an engineering background. And I really appreciated that about Hal. One thing that I learned in retrospect is that when these types of extraordinary tragedies happen, particularly when there's loss of crew, everything is in hurry-up mode. People are very tense. There is a lot of chaotic activity, and it's not always possible to think clearly and calmly at the very beginning of who the right people are to be on the mishap investigation board, who to put in the contingency plan. We were fortunate that the original 8 were mostly named, except for the chair and the NASA person. And the chair is somebody who is so central that it would probably be a good idea to have a short list, particularly where crew is involved, where the administrator or deputy administrator could go and look and say, yeah, out of these 3 or 4 names, I think this person would be really ideal. My personal experience on mishap investigations was limited. We had some small things that happened around the center that required that I review what the causes and the fixes were, but I'd never been on anything of the scale of the Columbia board. Nevertheless, my entire career at that point, some 30 years long, had been devoted to science and engineering research, very specifically taking a lot of data and a lot of facts, forming hypotheses, looking at it in a rigorous fashion, and then coming up with the kind of approach or the kind of next steps that were necessary to get the job done. And for the Columbia board work that I did, which culminated in the impact testing, I found this experience, this background, to be extremely valuable. So maybe there's a lesson there. Clearly, you could pick people, the designated associate administrator or center director who perhaps had a policy background. That might be valuable down the road. But I think when you're right in the middle of trying to figure out not only what went wrong, but why it went wrong, having someone with an analytic background, a background in science or engineering, could be extremely valuable. Of course, in anything that is as broad in scope and visible as the shuttle tragedy, there are going to be startup transients as you're getting the group together. We were pulled very hastily to first the Barksdale Air Force Base, and then quickly relocated to a building that had some empty space in it that was nearby Johnson Space Center, but not actually on the center property. In our initial discussions, the original 8 people that were on the board, we thought it was important to be close by where the human spaceflight program was directed from, but not so close as to be part of it, give us an arm's length distance. And then it took a while to get all the people together. The first order of business was search and recovery for the crew remains, obviously, and also for the pieces of the shuttle, whatever could be found. And I was surprised, as Hal Gaiman was, that you could in fact go to something like a catalog of emergency rescue and search people. These are the sorts of people that work on forest fires and tragedies. It's contractors, sometimes it's volunteers and so forth. And very quickly they deployed thousands of people out in the fields of Texas searching for this debris. With respect to the board, we were the original nucleus of 8, but it was clear we had a lot of work to do. And the military people reached back into their organizations and brought in staff. I realized that if I was going to carry out some of this analytic capability that I thought would be important, I needed help. So I reached back into NASA Ames and brought a few folks out, particularly some people who are deep, recognized experts in what's called thermal protection systems. But as we pulled our staff together over the first several weeks, we eventually, I think, hit 100 plus people working in the building. We turned our attention as a board to what kind of a report we were going to write. One of the people on the board, who was from the FAA, the Chief Accident Investigator, Steve Wallace, showed us the National Transportation Safety Board reports. And my roommate and I, Roger Tetrault, looked at these, and they were filled with acronyms, deeply technical, and really hard to read unless you were an expert in the field. So in our discussions, we had a meeting every morning. Hal said this is a 24/7 activity, at least to begin with, and we met every single morning and talked about what we had done and what we were planning to do. We talked about the report, and the consensus was quickly reached that these National Transportation Safety Board reports were simply too complex. We needed to explain something to the American people who had funded the shuttle program. We needed to tell them, as Hal put it, not only what bracket broke, but also why it happened. And we rapidly adopted a sort of maybe New York Times Science Tuesday level of explanation, something that the interested layperson could read and could understand. One of the things we wrestled with early on was to what extent was our board going to be a review body that sat like many project reviews do. I've been in hundreds, uncounted numbers of review meetings. Typically what happens is you have a group of 6, 8, 10, 15 people, all experts, senior people, and they are given a day or 2 or 3 worth of presentations. Then you huddle up and you write a report based on those presentations. And that's it. Then the board goes home. We discussed on the Columbia board the need to go beyond the standard project review board or advisory committee level of effort. This was a national, indeed an international tragedy. And frankly, it is very difficult for an agency to investigate itself. This was a point brought up by the safety investigators on the board, by our FAA representative. You really do need to have an independent look when something this monumental happens. And so, although it evolved over time, we took the position pretty early on that we were going to have to be, as a board, hands-on. We were going to have to get in there, see the data, listen to the people ourselves, and make up our own line of inquiry and come up with our own conclusions. Otherwise, we felt that our contribution would be very limited, and just reviewing somebody else's view graphs was not going to be sufficient. In our morning meetings, we discussed how we were going to operate. It was clear at 8, and then eventually we expanded to 13 people, the same number as the Rogers Commission, that was simply too many people to operate as a committee of the whole. And we had different skill sets. The people from the Safety Center for Naval Aviation, the person from the Air Force Safety Center and so forth, General Barry and Admiral Turcotte and so forth, they were very interested because of their backgrounds in the safety culture. What was in the thought of the people who were on the ground and the crew about how to approach this. I came from the science and engineering background, as did people like Roger Tetrault and Jim Halleck and others. So it was somewhere within the first month or so that we said we probably need to split into a couple of groups. And we ended up with 3. The group I was in was the Science, Engineering, Test, and Analysis group. We took on things like looking at the very limited video of the launch and some of the re-entry, but mostly of the launch. We looked at things like the possible fault tree. Of all the different thousands of things what could have gone wrong. And then I took on as my personal responsibility looking at the types of ways in which the thermal protection system would respond to an impact. Roger Tetrault was very interested in the debris reconstruction. There's a big hangar down at Kennedy Space Center where all of the materials that were found were brought and tagged and located. So as this group evolved, we began to spend a lot of time, with help from staff, in these individual areas. One comment, though, that may be a lesson for the future is not only the need to have different groups looking at different aspects and looking at them deeply, but the time allocation. We were initially told this was a 30-day commitment. After the first several weeks, it became clear that this was going to take far longer than that. And we had people there with very, very senior responsibilities. I had a center to run. We were very close to making a selection on a new type of organization to benefit the system. I was the selection official. So many of us ended up operating two different lives. You'd spend the whole day working on the Columbia board, and then at night or during a break, go and contact your organization to be sure that if you had to make a decision, that it was being taken care of. And so this led a lot of people pretty close to burnout. We were operating initially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Later on, we backed off from that, but it was very intense going, and there were, among the board members, there was a lot of juggling of responsibilities. One thing I noticed in retrospect is how much this whole effort, the Columbia Board investigation, resembled a project. We had our early study phase of doing a lot of effort trying to understand what box we were living in, what the objectives were, what the requirements were. Then we moved into a cadence, sort of a level of effort of operations. And then as those things like the debris collection and the impact testing began to come to a conclusion, we shifted to the final piece, which would be like getting ready for launch, which was the preparation of the report. And that whole project took about 7 months with different phases, so any future group that is planning to do that should be prepared for shifting gears as the different pieces come together. I'd like to talk about the impact testing that we conducted down at the Southwest Research Institute, which is in San Antonio. We'd been very fortunate to have this particular facility. Early on, I think it was maybe March or so, the group of us, myself in particular, that was involved with analyzing all the empirical data, that we needed at some point to conduct some tests just to validate what we thought we were seeing. The photographic results, the photographic archive, which was really only 2 pieces, videotape and one 35 millimeter, showed a piece of foam hitting the leading edge, or what appeared to be the leading edge of the orbiter. And we wanted to try to understand what that could have done. As we dug into it, we found that the background was very limited. There's something called a crater model that really had more to do with impacts of material, foam, other things, on the glass-like primary thermal protection system. You know, how much could you gouge out of this ceramic and have it still be thermally protecting the orbiter? Crater model was not particularly impressive. It was something like a spreadsheet with data as old as the Apollo era entered into it. It was not a physics-based, true, what the experts called hydrocode. It was not a thing that went to the fundamentals. It was like a lookup table. So with all these question marks about what would have happened if a piece of foam actually did hit either the tiles or, more likely, what's called reinforced carbon-carbon. It's the very, very high temperature material that sits at the nose and the leading edge where the shuttle would experience temperatures up to 3,000 degrees. To do some real experimental data gathering, we needed the ability to fire pieces of foam at the different places or mock-ups of different places that the shuttle had. The big acreage areas of tiles, and particularly the leading edge, the curved part, the front part of the wing of the shuttle. Southwest Research Institute had built such a facility. It was widely used by aircraft manufacturers, even regulatory agencies, to look at bird strikes. The name of it was the chicken gun. They had this big tube with compressed gas, and they would fire thawed out chickens from the supermarket toward things like fuselages and wings of airplanes to try to understand how bird strikes affected airplanes. So this was an ideal place to begin with. They made it available. The NASA team started constructing mock-ups, and we did some modifications to the gun at Southwest in order to fit in a piece of foam that would resemble what the photographic experts told us was the most probable size of the foam that struck the Columbia. One of the things that I did, and several of the members of the board did, was to attend NASA meetings. There was a lot of work going on inside the agency, and not just at Johnson Space Center, but all over. And the board was invited to sit in on those meetings and observe. One of the meetings that I went to was where there was ongoing discussion about how big the piece of foam was that had hit the orbiter. And I was quite taken and annoyed by the fact that there were a couple of representatives, particularly some of the people from Marshall Space Flight Center, who really refused to agree with the other experts about the size of the foam. They kept insisting that it had to be smaller, it couldn't have been that big. You know, in rough terms, it was appeared to be something about 15 inches by 11 inches by 3 or 4 inches, kind of the size of a small briefcase. So that made me concerned about the pace of the NASA work that was going on, and maybe also some of what was emerging as a cultural issue, that people inside the agency were a little bit reluctant to really point the finger at anything like the foam. So as a result of this, we had several discussions at our morning board meetings about what we should do next. And I said, look, I've taken on this thermal protection systems, impact analysis, and so forth. And my roommate, Roger Tetrault, said to me one day, we're really going to have to blow a hole in something. Now, I think he meant it figuratively, but that set me to thinking about where we ought to go with this work beyond just analysis and into direct experiment. So I went over, had a meeting with the Deputy Center Director, I believe, of Johnson Space Center, and Ralph Rowe, who was at the time heading up one of the internal NASA groups. And in his portfolio was the preparation for testing foam as it hit pieces of tile and so forth. And Ralph and I began to discuss what the next steps were. And he was advocating a long-term, very detailed, very stepwise and deliberate approach to slowly ramping up the size, the velocity, the angles, and so forth. And I could see that we weren't going to get to anything that resembled the actual event that probably was the technical cause of the tragedy anytime soon. And I told Ralph that, and he disagreed in strong terms. And I disagreed in strong terms and said, look, we need, for purposes of the nation, and I think of the agency too, to really make it very clear what the technical cause was. And what you're proposing is a long-term experimental test program. It'd be great when you get all the data, but that's not what we need right then. So it got pretty heated, and I guess we agreed to disagree. And I went back to Admiral Gaiman and sat down with him, and I said, look, Cal, I think that we've got a problem here. And you know, Roger Tetrault, either then or shortly after, weighed in with his opinion too. That was the same thing, that we needed to take a direct hand as the board in the conduct of this experimental test program in order to collect data that was as close as possible to the actual velocity, size, angle, and so forth that we thought caused the accident. And after some discussion, Hal agreed with me and made a few phone calls, and it was that point that we really, the board and myself in particular, began to really take a direct hand in designing and signing off on the specific tests. I think one thing that should be clear is that the direction of the test program by the board, and me in particular, really occurred in two phases. The first phase was specifying the tests to be taken and actually signing off on them. I mean, the way in which we guaranteed that we would have what we wanted as a board was to say that no test will be conducted unless I had signed off on the test plan. I was assisted a great deal here by two people that were brought in from, one from the FAA, Paul Wild, and another fellow named Pye, who was retired but had come via the Naval Research Lab. Dave Pye, I think was his name. And they helped me a lot with this design. And so that guaranteed that the work carried out at Southwest Research would be as the board wanted it, to get to the configuration and all the parameters that was as close as possible to the accident as we could make it. As we got into this with Leading Edge, which was more and more in the photographic analysis and the debris reconstruction, showing that a certain panel, panel 8, was the one that most probably was struck by the foam. It became necessary to move away from the fiberglass that we had borrowed off of the Enterprise. The Enterprise was a mock-up drop test shuttle that was built out of fiberglass. And we did some good work getting our test articles and getting the gun lined up and so forth. But the fiberglass was not RCC. It was not reinforced carbon-carbon, which is a very strong but brittle material. High thermal resistance, but very brittle. So the second phase of taking control of this was to convince NASA to provide us with an actual RCC flight article, one that had roughly the same number of flights as Columbia, taken off of one of the other shuttles. Well, this request provoked intense pushback. We were given a lot of reasons. These were expensive. They cost $700,000 a piece. It takes months to make them. We don't have that many in stock, and so forth and so on. And I think Gaiman was originally swayed by these arguments because I think in part he felt that the circumstantial evidence that the foam hit the leading edge and roughly the spot was the most probable cause. But I went to Hal and I said, Hal, there's more at stake here. I detect from the shuttle program people I'm working with, the engineers, a very human psychological response, which is denial. It is like in the phases of accepting the death of a loved one, and anger and denial usually come first. It takes some work to get to acceptance. And I said, I think we really do need to conduct this experiment as close as possible to the actual event with real RCC. And Hal said, well, let's discuss it with the board. Hal said he's reluctant to make this decision all by himself. So it was only the second time, in my recollection, the board ever took a vote. The first was when the original 8 actually voted on adding the other 5 names and expanding to 13 people for a bunch of reasons. The second was my request that we use real flight RCC material. So we had a meeting. I think that between the people in the room and the people on the phone, we had almost all of the 13 either present or on the line. And I explained what I wanted to do. I explained the rationale behind it. I explained what I thought were some of the psychological factors involved. And there was some question and answer. A couple of people spoke up in favor of doing this. And then Hal said, okay, well, let's vote. And it was unanimous. They said, yes, we agree, we must go do this. We really got to put an exclamation point at the end of our technical cause statement. So Hal got on the phone and talked to, I think, the associate administrator in charge of human spaceflight, maybe even the administrator himself. And in the end, NASA gave us the panel that we needed, and then we were able to conduct the test. After all of our preparations, our engineering team had a pretty good idea, a very, very good idea of the exact angle, the size, the velocity of the piece of foam that hit panel 8, the leading edge, and that's the mock-up that we put together in San Antonio at the Southwest Research Institute. It was quite a day. It was July the 7th. We'd taken a short break on July 4th, and we came back prepared to do this final test with everything set up as close as humanly possible to the actual conditions. It was 100 degrees plus. You're out there in the desert land of Texas, and it was going to be on national TV. My staff, my small group of engineers supporting me, were horrified, and they came to me and said, "This is going to be on TV? Are you crazy?" You know, and I said, "Look, remember, this was before you had a blogger at every computer, but I said, there is a group of people out there who, if we don't do this live in front of everybody, if we do this and come out and announce the results, that group will say something was phony, something was faked, NASA's hiding something." I said, we have no choice but to do what NASA's always done, but do it as a board, which is here in the fishbowl with everybody watching. And so they said, well, okay. So I signed off on the test plan, and we had the press physically there. There was a pool camera watching this mock-up, watching the leading edge, right distant from the gun. That was being fed to nationwide TV. And I had astronauts right next to me, one on either side of me. They'd been following us around through the whole program because it was their life at stake sitting on top of this controlled explosion. And I'll never forget that moment. 100 degrees, this place out there, desert land full of snakes. And we had this intense set of lighting, 16 or 17 cameras going at thousands of frames a second to capture every piece of data we could. There was a countdown at 0, the gun fired, there was a slight mist, and when it cleared, we could see this gigantic hole blown in the leading edge of the wing by this piece of foam. And then I rushed up. The astronauts came with me. The press was behind a rope, and we went over there and we looked at it. And I had two very distinctly different emotions. On one hand, I wanted to say yes, because engineering had demonstrated without a doubt that the foam was the cause. The foam did it. The foam blew a hole in the wing. And at the same time, I felt this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that we had just observed what had in fact killed a crew of 7 people. And I remember going up to the whole test area there and looking at this big hole. It was something like 14 inches, I think. And young woman, engineer from the shuttle program at Johnson Space Center, who'd been working with us, came up to me, and she literally had tears in her eyes and said, "So this is what did it, right? This is what killed the crew." And I said, "Yep, yeah, I think we now know for sure." So I went over and talked to the press, and very next day it was clear to the world, or it was clear to the world right then, and in all the articles the next day, what the physical cause of the accident had been. One thing that I learned by going through this 7 months of the Columbia board is that when you're dealing with a tragedy of this magnitude, you're not just dealing with physics and engineering. You're dealing with psychological issues, you're dealing with sociological issues, you're dealing with people who were involved with the program who quite naturally are starting off at a phase of anger and denial. And you have to be prepared, if you're involved in an investigation like this, for all of the non-technical issues as well. And this is sometimes a bit difficult for scientists and engineers to do, but it's very necessary. You have to realize the way people react to tragedies and what their natural inclinations will be, and you have to be able to deal with that and prepare for that. Another observation I could make is the importance of the external independent body like the Columbia Board, and the importance of us injecting ourselves in a very hands-on way at a critical phase of the investigation. It is a truism that organizations, by and large, have great difficulty investigating themselves. It's just human nature, it's a fact. And so in the future, however it is set up, and maybe it doesn't have to be as hands-on, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it was for the board to get in and be responsible, even to the point of signing off on a test plan, for the impact testing and for other parts of the investigation, because it was only by that action that we were able to be so definitive in our cause statement. And there are no qualifiers in there on the technical cause at all. It's not most probable, it's not circumstantial, it is definitive. And I don't think that would have happened without the board inserting itself personally into that action. So lesson learned, you've got to have independent analysis and verification, and sometimes you even need external control. One of the things that we had to deal with very early on was the independence of the board. And I felt this acutely, since I was the only NASA guy on this board made up of people from other agencies and outside. And I struggled with this initially. And in fact, there was a person who contacted me, somebody that worked, as we say, on the 9th floor, who worked in the administrator's suite, who called me on my cell phone and asked that I periodically update them on how things were going. And I did this a few times and grew very uncomfortable with the sense that I was some kind of a mole or spy or something. It just didn't feel right. And so after doing this a few times, I came to the conclusion that I needed to act completely independently, that I need to call them like I see them. And if I was going to be a member of the board, I had to be a member of the board. I couldn't do both jobs. I couldn't continue to be a NASA person providing insights and observations to my formal bosses and also serve as a independent member of the board. And so I stopped calling these folks and just said, look, I need to disengage, and I need to go be an independent member of the board. I had a discussion with Hal Gaiman about this. This all happened sometime in the first few weeks. And I told Hal that I was committed to calling them like I see them, being an independent board member, and that was the only way in which I could feel comfortable being the, a NASA senior person on the board. And he said, fine. Gaiman said, I appreciate that, I respect that. How do you want to make it known? And I said, well, whenever we have a press conference, I'll just say something. Be sure that I get a minute or two somewhere along the line to express my point of view. And so it was one of the very first press conferences where the board was being introduced to the media. And Hal made sure that I got a minute or so to introduce myself. And I made a point in public of saying, I realize I'm the only NASA person on this board, but I want to assure everyone that I'm going to act in a fair, objective, independent manner. I'm going to call them like I see them, and we'll do the best we can to find out what happened so that it won't happen again. That was all in the context of a broader sense of questions about the independence of the board, because unlike the Rogers Commission, which was presidentially appointed, this group had been appointed as part of a contingency plan, and that contingency plan had the board reporting out to the administrator. And Gaiman, by his own account to the rest of us, made it very clear to Sean O'Keefe that he intended for the board to be completely independent, to do what was necessary, and let the chips fall where they may. There was some, according to Hal Gaiman, some friction and tension around this, but Hal didn't get to be a four-star admiral without knowing how to work inside the Beltway. And he said quite candidly that if he hadn't been given the reins to run this the way he needed to, he would have simply gone to his people on the Hill or in the administration and made sure that we got a presidential commission. But he didn't want to disrupt everything to do that unless it was absolutely necessary. So in the end, there was a détente or an agreement that the board would in fact be independent and Hal could run this show the way he felt it was necessary. Another personal aspect that I experienced was not only the initial conflict about how to act independently when I was still employed by NASA, but the realization, particularly as we were writing the report, that I had to go back and be a NASA center director. I had to go back and be a senior member of the agency. And this set me thinking and worrying and wondering a little bit about how I would be received. And when I did get back, I remember the very first senior executive group meeting. It was a meeting of the AAs and the center directors after the report had been submitted. And I did feel some coolness from certain people. And I thought that there were people who were looking at me, wondering if I had been true to the agency. But the thing that made it all worthwhile was the response I got from the astronaut corps. In every room at our place in Texas and in where we did the final report in Washington, D.C., in every room there was a picture of the Columbia crew, and we reminded continuously that we were doing this investigation and this report for them and for the astronaut corps. And one of my prized possessions is a picture of the Columbia, the crew, a scene from the flyover with the missing man formation they did at the memorial, and the inscription on this collage that I was given was, "From the astronaut corps, thank you for what you did, for your contribution." And that meant the world. It still means the world to me because it said that I did the right thing, that we did the right thing as a board. And if there were some people who perhaps didn't agree with it, well, in the big picture, I'm absolutely certain that we did the right thing, and I've never had any trouble looking myself in the mirror and feeling good about the decisions that were made. After all the test and analysis and all the data collection, we had the job of writing the report. And it occurred to more than one of us, and Hal Gaiman in particular, that with such a visible tragedy, such a high consequence event, we couldn't bury our findings and recommendations in arcane language readable by only a handful of people. We really did want to make this accessible to the world and to the American public, the taxpayer in particular. So there was a strong commitment from the early on to make this readable and understandable. Now, realizing that, actually carrying it out, is more difficult than saying it. The people who were on the board were selected for their experience, background, flight safety, engineering, etc., not for their writing skills necessarily. So we went through, I think, about a month or two, somewhere in there, somewhere between early July and August when the report was delivered, going over and over again the various pieces. Now, Hal, after some initial experience with writers that were brought in, technical writers who were brought in to help us, Hal decided that the only way he could get the kind of report that he thought we needed, that we all agreed we needed, was in effect to become the editor-in-chief. So we got writing assignments. I took on chapter 3, which was the physical cause chapter, and we started writing our words and assembling our graphics. Hal would say, "No, that's too long." And I said, but this figure must be in there. And he would say, "No, we don't have room for that figure." And so there was a lot of negotiation and back and forth on what would fit, what was relevant, what was germane. And in the end, Hal had the power of the pen and did, I think, an extraordinarily good job of producing a document that is almost a page turner. I go back and look at it now, almost 10 years later, and it's still very readable. The history of the shuttle, how that program came to be, is still very germane. And I think this may be a lesson for the future when you're dealing with these kinds of very, very visible, very important high consequence events, to be prepared for having to write down in a very understandable way what your findings were, what your recommendations are, because this is the sort of thing that needs to be kept for the future. One of the things that we recognized was that successful organizations that have a long history of working in a high consequence area but without accidents, those organizations are learning organizations. And the only way you learn is by looking back at what happened before. And that's why the record of what happened before in a clear, understandable way is so important. And so we ended up, I think, with a document that we're all still proud of to this day. I personally, in writing Chapter 3, drew heavily on the notes I had taken all along. If you're ever involved with something like this, be sure to keep sets of notes. Some people kept an actual journal. A lot of what I had was on my computer. However you do it, you will need that when it comes to summing up what you have experienced and what your recommendations are for the future. My key takeaways from this whole experience with serving on the Columbia Board come in a couple of different flavors. First of all, when you serve in such a capacity, it's very important to figure out first, like any project, what are the objectives, what are requirements, to whom do you report? That was a key area of tension that we had to sort out so that it was clear that we were acting independently. We decided early on that we needed to be involved, directly involved in the investigation, not just a passive review board. We decided early on that we were writing this and reporting this to the American people as well as to the agency. So figuring out those really fundamental issues, what are the constraints, what are the requirements, the objectives, and who is your customer for this report, all that's absolutely critical. The other thing about accidents in general that I learned is what some people describe as lining up the holes in the wheel of cheese. There are different analogies, but essentially it is that any huge tragedy that occurs, and there have been a lot of them that you can point to, gas pipelines that have exploded, and you dig back into history and you find a whole range of things that were missed, things that weren't done. The Columbia tragedy was no different. We found that there had been a long period of moving, for example, with the foam, from a serious in-flight anomaly to just a turnaround maintenance issue. And this was just one of several places where we found that these kinds of disasters don't just happen because a single thing went wrong. You will invariably find a long chain of events, of things that were neglected or overlooked or ignored, often any one of which, if it had been addressed early, would have prevented the accident. So really be prepared for seeing these historical trails of things that were ignored or missed or overlooked.